who creates money, the commercial banks or the central banks? We're going to do a little bit of a deep dive into the history of monetary environment. If you're interested in learning more and how money was created, please continue listening. Welcome to the Red to Black podcast, hosted by Werner and Mario, two Marine officers and businessmen. In this series, Boot Camp, we're covering the basic foundational building blocks of business. That's key if you want to build these solid, highly profitable businesses. Mario, what are your thoughts?
I think commercial banks produce the most amount of money in the world. It's not the central banks. The central banks are trying to encourage commercial banks to lend, but it's fractional lending by commercial banks that are creating the preponderance of currency currency units into the economy. What are your thoughts, Warner?
Yeah, that's correct. If you look at like the money supply, a small portion is like dollars and coins. The major portion is all the loans, the lines of credit, the credit cards, the car loans. I mean, behind every car loan, there's the financing department that's connected to a bank, or that finance department is a bank, right? So a little backstory on how money was created will help us sort of see why it is that the banks create this money. So let's go back to Egypt and Babylon, where guys were literally doing like accounting systems, debits and credits. So it didn't start out as coins. It started out as a guy on like a tablet papyrus, drawing a line, going, okay, you owe me this, I owe you this. And he did that for the whole village, and they had multiple department or whatever it was. But there was dudes writing lines on pieces of paper and doing credits and debits. And then you fast forward to Europe and they're like, well, that's not going to be the most efficient system because I've got to go to this individual to make a transaction, to record that transaction. It's going to be more efficient if we have this medium of exchange, so gold or silver. And it wasn't the value of the gold that really determined the monetary supply or the amount or the exchange rate. It was the fact that gold was it was unit of exchange or unit of account. It could clear your debits and your credits, and it was durable. Right. So they used it as this bucket. Imagine a gold bucket, and you put your value in that bucket, and that's how they traded value. And what happened was in Europe that the gold, when you got so much of it, it's like, I can't carry around all this gold. I'm going to leave it with a goldsmith. Right. And they would give you a certificate of deposit. So what the goldsmith started doing was, all right, I have a certificate of deposit. Let's say I have 1,000 pieces of gold coins. Right. And they said, well, I know all these individuals that gave me these gold coins or lent them to me. They're not going to all come back from the same time. So I'm going to start lending some of these coins out. And then they started thinking, they're like, well, I don't need to lend these coins out. Why don't I lend the promissory notes out and I can keep the gold here? Not have to worry about, giving a guy gold when he comes back. And then they had another idea, which was illegal because it said in the promissory note, you can't create more value. They said, I'm going to start creating more promissory notes, where this is where the fractional reserve banking system was born. And I'm going to start lending out more money. Out of that came the Bank of London, came bonds, came the whole financial system. And what the Goldsmiths really created from that fractional reserve system that people trusted through the promissory notes, they created their own promissory notes, was the beginning of how money was created by banks in these economies. That was the beginning, was these goldsmiths taking the promissory notes and taking fractions of them. So if they gave you like 100 gold coins, you lend out 90 of them, right? And then that created the Bank of London. And then these banks started just creating money out of thin air through loans, lines of credit, credit cards. And that's where we are today, where really the base money, that gold or the coinage or whatever it is really irrelevant. What's really relevant is the banks lending out money to individuals. Now, when they lend out money, the key thing is they're looking for collateral, because the banks can go bankrupt, right? Even though they're making this free money, they think, oh, it's a money party, and I can just like lend out. No. They can go. These guys have skin in the game just as much as any other institution. So when they lend out on a house or a business, they're looking for collateral in case that money doesn't come back to them or the individual defaults on that money. Well, same thing. But that's the banking system. So how do they create more money? They create more money based on loans and based on viable individuals that are going to take those loans and they're going to pay back those loans. That's how money's created. Mario, your thoughts?
I want to tie this to inflation or deflation and kind of bring this down really simple. Is when you see a $3 trillion spending bill into the economy, it's not necessarily inflation. It's not inflationary and it's by itself. The Fed lends money to the Treasury. So the U.S. Treasury borrows money from the Fed. The Fed can create digital currency, push it into the U.S. Treasury, and the government can spend that into the economy. And you say, well, that's inflationary, $3 trillion. Well, at the same time, the banking sector, they have commercial mortgage-backed securities, CMBSs, that might be losing $3 trillion at the same time. So at the same time the U.S. government is spending $3 trillion, the banks are losing $3 trillion of money that's been created into the system. It's a net wash. There is no inflation. You've had 3 trillion currency notes disappear out of the economy because those mortgage-backed securities are not being paid back to the banks. The money that was created through those loans isn't being paid back. It's being destroyed. Also, if they're not creating new loans, $1 billion came back to the bank and they're not issuing out another $1 billion. They're paying off the Fed, or they're moving that money out of the system. They're not creating another loan. That's deflationary. So just because we see that the Fed and the Treasury are creating currency notes doesn't necessarily mean we're going to have inflation, folks. You got to look at what's happening in the mortgage-backed securities. What's happening in the banks? They're lending less. That's incredibly deflationary, meaning there's less currency units in the economy.
Yeah, and that's a great point. And what that points to is we always want to look at where is the majority of the money being created, and that's created by banks lending, whether it's in the form of like car loans, lines of credit, home equity lines of credit, credit cards,
mortgage-backed securities.
Mortgage-backed securities. Primarily, it's probably loans. I haven't looked at the numbers. I forget what the numbers say, but we'll do a midnight patrol for you guys where we do the accounting deep dives, and we'll see who's awake at the end, right? So the point is when you're assessing the monetary system, always look at the banks, the commercial banks. They're the ones from the days of the Goldsmiths. They're the ones who are saying, hey, I have these deposits on hand. Now, here's the key differentiator. How the Fed works real simply with the banks. The Fed has reserve requirements, which I think are at zero right now, for the banks, for the deposits they get from individuals so they can pay back those deposits. There's not runs on banks. So say, for example, all the deposits from individuals out in the market is 10 million. The bank's like, you have to keep $1 million on hand, 10%, right? In case like there's a run on the banks, you have some money to pay some people that are running, taking their money out of the banks. That doesn't apply to loans. That only applies to bank deposits. But bank loans, which is another form of kind of bank deposit because it credits money into your account, right? That's not created by people making money through employment and coming in and depositing their money. That's created by the bank out thin air going, I'm going to issue a new loan because this guy's, he's good. He'll pay it back. He's got the collateral. He's got the track record. That's how the majority of the money is created. So what are you seeing right now when interest rates are really low? Stephen Van Meter talks about this. You're seeing an environment where there's not a lot of bank lending. And that's what interest rates are telling you. When interest rates are high, there's a lot of bank lending because they're trying to pull it back, right? There's so many loans. They're like, I can't handle any more of these loans. I got to get interest rates higher. When interest rates are lower, there's less lending. So that's what we're seeing in the economy. So what me and Mario, these are kind of assumptions because we haven't looked at the numbers. But what we're seeing in terms of this inflation, I think it's a supply shock and fear because of the sickness, which is causing this inflation. So you're having like multiple things going on. A lot of businesses have been put out because of this sickness, put out of business. And there's a lot of people not working. So their employer became the federal government when Mario said the Fed lent the money to the Treasury and the Treasury paid the money to these individuals for the business that aren't working. That's a mouthful. You might have to rewind that to figure that whole chain backwards. But that is what's going on. So it's just a transfer of payment from private sector paying the individuals to the government paying the individuals. So it's like, that's what we're saying. It's kind of a moot point, guessing. Now you have supply shock.
We don't know. The reality is, Warren, we'll never know. You don't know every bank's, you're not able to calculate what banks are creating and what's being lost at the bank in real time. You can kind of put it together with some of the bigger banks and knowing, oh, they're not doing well. commercial mortgage-backed securities are losing right now. It's a huge loss in banks right now. But the exact dollar amount at the exact time, and then comparing it to how much money is coming into the system, you don't know. You can make some educated guesses, but you don't know exactly. And what we're speculating, what Warner is speculating is we're not in hyperinflation because the banks are losing and not creating more loans. Yeah, the Fed is issuing money to the Treasury, and the Treasury is spending that into the economy. 60% of the GDP of our country in the United States is government spending. At the same time, the banks are pulling back loans. The banks are not getting their money back from people who have borrowed it. They're taking assets back that aren't worth what they lent on them. They were optimistic in the good times. They lent a bunch of money. Now that that asset has potentially been firebombed by rioters and it's worthless, and the people have gone, oh, I'm not paying it back. You have it. You take it back. They threw the keys, the proverbial keys, on the counter and said, you have it, bank. The bank just lost money. The bank just took money they didn't have, fractional lending. They lent it out on that building. They're not being paid back. There's less money in the system.
Yeah, and it's like Mario brought up a great point. It's so hard to tell because, you can tell sort of by common sense. If you drive around LA, you see most of these businesses, like leases are gone. Tenants are gone. Buildings are empty. You're going, I wonder who's paying that. No one's paying that.
How are they servicing the debt? If there's nobody if there's no shoppers in there and there's nobody leasing it, how are they servicing the debt? The reality is on most of those properties, they're not. The bank has taken it. It's basically in receivership, or it's in a transition between the owners and the bank. And the reality is that is contracting the money supply.
Exactly. And this is our assumption. And like Mario said, we can't really tell because no one's tracking all this. It's impossible. Then number two, so why are we seeing prices increase? Well, it's because, in my opinion, it's because of supply shocks. Because people, like, I'll give you an example. On the ground, I was in South Dakota last weekend, and for Rapid City all the way to Sturgis, which is like 30, 40 miles away, and 30, 40 miles the other direction, there's one dude delivering ice for the entire city. That is not an efficient ice operation. It's like crushed ice that you'd see. I went to multiple different gas stations. By the third gas station, I found 2 containers. Opened one, empty with ice. Opened the other one, the freezer, it had like a quarter of the ice left. I'm hearing this like through property managers. They're lowering their standards to get people to come work for them. So what we're seeing right now is labor shocks that are causing supply shocks. And then because of all these shutdowns, goods aren't coming as fast, so it's inflating prices. That's what I assume is happening. It's a supply shock, labor shock issue, as the monetary supply is maybe being blamed for. So everyone's like, go to gold. But we talked about in another podcast, gold's a commodity. So there's the reason why we talk about all this stuff. It's really good to know about your economy. But at the end of the day, if you don't know about any of that and you don't care about any of that, just focus on one thing alone. Pick highly profitable businesses that pay you to own them, that have been around for a while, invest in those businesses. Why would you want to kind of know about the economy? Well, you want to know, is that business, with the way the economy is going, is that business kind of marrying up with that economy? Is it going to work? That's why you want to know about the economy, because you want to know, now you pick the business going out into the future, is this business going to work in that type of environment? Are they making the moves, if it's not, to move to other environments where it will work? That's why you want to know about economic environments, intel. That's why we teach it. So any final thoughts, Mario?
2 gentlemen to study for my autistic nephews out there that have the time and the intelligence to put this together is Peter Thiel and Jim Rickards. Those 2 gentlemen, I don't think anybody knows exactly how this is going to play out. Warner and I don't claim to know exactly how this is going to play out, but both of those gentlemen are very interesting. They got very interesting data at their disposal, and they're making very interesting moves. One owns a farm in the mountains. One owns a homestead in New Zealand. They're both very data driven. They're piped into to resources and data sets that enable them to make predictions about the future, and they happen to be right a lot. So I'd study those 2 gentlemen if I were a betting man, which I am, and I am studying Peter Thiel and Jim Rickards. Those are the guys I'd look at right now for the next 5 to 10 years. Thanks for your time, Warner. Appreciate it.
Yeah, those are great points, and thank you guys for listening. Subscribe to the podcast, like and comment, because that helps us get this out to the world. And as always, we look forward to connecting with you in the future.